What are the ramifications for the Cuban people of President Trump's oil siege? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Welcome to this issue of Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. Joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, who was actually vice president of academic affairs 36 years ago when we started FFF. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you too.
Yeah, well, Richard, we published a book 36 years ago called The Failure of America's Foreign Wars. And it was a timeless book because the principles there are as applicable today as they were back then. And we can see this going on with this situation in Venezuela and Cuba with President Trump and the national security establishment. I mean, I just consider it horrific what's going on here. I've been reading accounts, mostly in El País, the Spanish newspaper in Madrid, of the suffering, extreme suffering of the Cuban people. I mean, they are really on the verge. They don't have any medicines. Their electricity is gone most of the day, or at least much of the day. They've had to cancel flights into the country because they don't have enough gasoline to fill up the plane on the way back. And everybody's terrified. Everybody's scared to death. I mean, about food, about anything. And Trump has essentially put this oil siege on Cuba. I mean, after doing it to Venezuela and getting Venezuela to capitulate after they went in there and kidnapped the president and took him back to New York, they've got this, what really has turned out to be a puppet, who's a communist, socialist, narco-terrorist. At least that's what they've accused her of in the past, running the show on behalf of Trump, taking orders from him. That's certainly the way the dissident Maria Corina Machado put it, that Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president, is taking orders. So she can't release any more oil to Cuba. That's what they were depending on. It's a socialist communist regime there, as we all know. But Mexico was there furnishing oil too. They didn't buy into all this anti-communist crusade that the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA have been waging for so many years. But now Trump has said anybody that gives oil to Cuba is going to be hit with extreme sanctions from the U.S. And so nobody wants to take that chance. Everybody's scared to death. But the people who are most terrified in this thing, and rightly so, are the Cuban people. I mean, they are on the verge of starvation. They're on the verge of massive illness. They can't get any good medical treatment in terms of medicines and stuff for all the weird diseases that pop up in Central American countries and Caribbean countries. It's just evil, Richard. What's going on here is just evil. Trump says, "Oh, well, Cuba's a supporter of terrorism." Are you kidding me? I mean, you've got a state sponsor of terrorism in the U.S. government. This is terrorism. Targeting innocent people as a way to punish a regime or get regime change. That's the very essence of state-sponsored terrorism. Why target the innocent civilians? To me, it's just the absolute essence of evil. I visited Cuba, and the Cuban people are the nicest people I've ever seen. They were so nice to me, even though they knew I was part of the United States. I was part of this government that's imposed this embargo on the notion that, oh, the red regime's coming to get us. There's never been any indication that Cuba was coming to get us, ever since Fidel Castro took over. The U.S. has always been the aggressor. The U.S. tried to assassinate their president. The U.S. initiated terrorist attacks in Cuba, as well as, blew up that airliner with all those young Cubans on it that was coming back to Cuba. And the embargo that has squeezed the life out of the Cuban people, along with their, of course, their socialist system, is like a vice. And all the Cubans ever said was, just leave us alone. Leave us alone. But The empire cannot leave them alone, Richard. They hate it's not anymore, I don't think, a big anti-communist thing, or the Reds are coming to get us like the whole Cold War racket was. I think it's now they just hate an independent regime anywhere in the world, but especially over here in this hemisphere. So Venezuela, they hated because it was independent, not because it was socialist or communist, because look, Trump is now maintaining the socialist communist regime in Venezuela. He's not doing any regime change there. Not that I'm advocating that, but he could just walk away and leave them alone. But no, he's partnering now with the communist, socialist, what he called a narco-terrorist regime. Uh, and why? Well, he's getting his oil. Okay, I think he said they've sold $1 billion of oil and they're depositing it in Qatar, the foreign country, and where the Supreme Court possibly won't be able to stop him. I mean, he's a central planner here. He's in charge of this country, and she is his puppet. Now, it's hard to blame her because she knows that if she doesn't play ball with Trump and doesn't follow his orders, as Maria Corina Machado said, he'll go after her. He'll put the oil siege back on, and he will go in there and have his forces kidnap her. They've got an indictment hanging over her head, just like they did with Maduro. Now, it may be a secret indictment, a pocket indictment. It may not even be an indictment yet, but that's what's hanging over her head because the DEA made her a target of the investigation too on the drug war. So all they got to tell her is, you don't follow my orders, and we will kidnap you and bring you back and have you indicted. Um, and so she gets off a year from now. What difference does it make? She's there, spent a year in jail. She doesn't want to go down that road, so she's faithfully following Trump's orders. But at the same time, you can tell she's chafing at it. This is not some born again capitalist that has suddenly become a free marketeer. She even said that if Machado comes back, that she's under indictment herself. And why is she under indictment? Because she supported the sanctions against Trump sanctions against and the U.S. national security state sanctions. She supposedly supported the invasion that took out what's his name, Maduro, and she's did something else. I forget what it was. That these are considered criminal offenses, and you can understand why they'd be considered criminal offenses if you take the standpoint of the government. So this whole thing is, to me, very evil. It's combustible. I don't. They think it's all stable. I don't think it's stable at all. I think it's just a question of time before it blows up. What do you think?
Well, I think it would be useful for us to step back and understand the more general mindset that leads not just Trump, but in fact every U.S. administration for the post-war era to have this notion of going to war against an entire nation and sanctioning an entire nation. And that is that in the older liberal era of the 19th and early part of the 20th century, there had emerged an understanding, this classic liberal ideal, if not always perfectly put into practice, of separating the state from the population, from the government versus the citizenry. And that if you went to war against another government, fair game with the soldiers and the military infrastructure of the opposing party. But there had developed in the last decades of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th rules of war. Non-combatants were not to be negatively affected. Their lives and property were not to be threatened unless there was a clear indication that some member of the civilian population was actively and intentionally serving the opposing army with whom you were still at war. Uh, you would not destroy infrastructure, hospitals, educational facilities. Uh, War was to be limited to those who were the combatants, with the realization that there's always spillover effects, but you should have the intention even in the heat of battle to minimize the negative consequences, the the negative spillover effects on the civilian population and they're private property. But in the 20th century, first in the First World War and then totally representing the Second World War, there became a new implicit and practice philosophy, and that is the total state. There is no distinction and separation between the government with which you are war and the civilian population. They are one and the same. That's how we viewed the bombing of German cities that did not necessarily have war justifying targets, or the fire bombings of Japanese cities before the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that has remained the attitude since then with such things as sanctions, or if you think of the use of napalm during the Vietnam War and its indiscriminate effect, as well as with Agent Orange on the civilian sectors of the population. And so this idea of sanctions, that to topple a government, you punish a population, that punishing the population by definition will bring down a government, fails to see that one does not follow the other. Uh, and when Trump says that he is threatening any country that sells oil or other everyday or even medical necessities to the Cuban people or the government, that they will be sanctioned to intimidate them, as you were pointing out. He's basically saying that what they're targeting is everyone on the island of Cuba. All those who are non-political, those who in their hearts might be hating the system, but you keep your mouth shut for obvious reasons, as well as those who are the infrastructure of the Cuban government and the Communist Party and their version of what would be a national security state that they use to stay in power. So there are no innocents, and that's the same attitude in Venezuela. The idea is that you deal with the government because by dealing with the government, you somehow are assuring that the people have a different life. Now, unless Trump decides to push buttons and intimidate that new interim leadership, who is basically all the old communist infrastructure under Maduro, as you were saying, nothing changes. Because as far as the US government is concerned, and to be honest, as far as the Chinese government is concerned, or the Russian government, given their behavior in bombing Ukraine, there is no distinction. This has been the epoch for over 120 years now of the total state and the total war. And as long as you have that mindset that everyone in a country that you are, for whatever reasoning, targeting as an enemy, as an opponent, as a threat, or just something that they have that you want, like Trump wants Greenland, Venezuelan oil, and so on, as long as you say that there is no distinction between the government that you're in conflict with for some reason and the civilian population that is under the jurisdiction of that opposing government, then you see these types of unjustifiable, in my opinion, and cruelly and brutally imposed policies that harm far more the innocents than it does anything to bring down the perpetrators who you say you're focusing on. And that's the dilemma. And it's basically a rejection of the liberal ideal of the sanctity of the rights of the individual, his life, liberty, and honestly acquired property. Governments do things beyond that. But even if there's another government that's going beyond that, you don't punish the people of that society because you have a gripe or complaints or reasons for going to war or imposing sanctions on the government that you're in a conflict with. And that is, Trump is in fact just following the policy that the US government in different settings and in different forms has followed both during and since the Second World War.
Yeah, but the hypocrisy is they pay lip service to this principle you're talking about. They say, "Oh, we don't target civilians when they go in on these bombing attacks on some third world country or something." They make that point that we're targeting only military installations, and so they don't intentionally do what they did, like at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or at least they make it look like they're not doing that, which is acknowledging the principle you're talking about, that it's wrong to do that. If it's not wrong to do it, then why do they pay lip service to it? The problem with sanctions is it looks like a benign thing. It's just an indirect thing. We're not bombing them. We're not shooting them. We're just starving them to death. It's simply the old Roman Empire siege mentality. That's the way I think of it. That when the Romans would meet some recalcitrant gang that was ensconced in a big castle somewhere where they were going to take unbelievable losses trying to attack this castle. They just surrounded the castle and refused to let any food get in and water. And they just waited until the surrender would come. And so the people would either choose to die or they'd surrender. Most of the time, they would surrender. There was one case where a Jewish enclave, they finally got into there and they'd all died. Their position was better to die a free person than to live a slave. Uh, so I think it's important that people like you and me and other libertarians that we remind Americans of this principle that you don't target civilians. That's what terrorists do. I mean, think about it. Terrorists strike, blow up a bomb in the middle of a city as a way to get the government to change its ways. And they say, if you don't change your policies, we're going to set up another bomb, and set up another bomb. And so the government finally says, well, gosh, we got to choose. And so, yeah, maybe, okay, we'll change our policy to save these people. It could go either way. But that's what these sanctions are. They're saying you change your policy in Cuba to either become our slave, our servant, like Delcy Rodriguez. You can stay socialist communist. That's one thing's real clear. There's no principled objection here to this socialist communist narco-terrorist regime in Cuba, as long as they're doing our bidding. If they're our little slave, that's all that matters. And I can't help but think, Richard, that the Venezuelan people are very resentful of this. Even the ones that hate the Maduro Chavista regime, which I would estimate about 80%, because the whole thing is so humiliating to see this Venezuelan official essentially become a serf or a slave. Yes, master. Yes, master. I mean, this is the way slaves were treated in the old South. Yes, master. Yes, master. Oh, it's so good to serve you. Oh, it's so good to be on your plantation. Thank you for feeding me and so forth. Thank you for this oil company, this oil revenue you're sending me. Oh, thank you. And they're trying to get these American oil companies into there, and they're reluctant because it's not the same, Richard. Trump's trying to act like it's all the same, like it was back in the 50s and 60s with Shell Oil there and other American oil companies. Well, they were there by invitation of the Venezuelan government. So it was a very harmonious relationship between the two. This is more of an occupation type thing. Those American companies go in there, I think are going to be subject to some severe ambushes from people and assassination attempts against the officials. Because this is expropriation by coercion. This is not a voluntary transaction where the Venezuelan government is welcoming these oil companies in there. And if I were an oil company executive or oil field worker or something, I wouldn't want to go into that country. To me, it's like, being in Iraq as an American soldier.
Well, I'll just say you're saying that you see hypocrisy, but it's a hypocrisy that pervades much that governments do. Why is it that whether it be in Russia or China or a whole variety of authoritarian-led regimes around the world, they do elections? The media, whether it's left, right, or center, usually points out that many of these elections in other parts of the world are just uh, manipulated, controlled. Uh, Opposition is arrested or killed or muted in some way to assure that those currently in power stay in power. But why do they even bother with the guise of an election? Because the idea that the government is supposed to represent the will of the people. That is, the people select those who will hold office and are supposed to serve the people and not be the masters, is such endemic now in the world due to the triumphs of a wide variety of liberal ideas, including liberal democracy in the 19th century, that you can't operate without this. It's the clothes that the emperor wears to have some type of nominal justification and rationale for his power. When Trump talks about, we're there to help the Iranian people, he doesn't give a crap, I personally think, about the Iranian people. What he does care about is getting rid of their nuclear weapons, which, given America's presence in the Middle East and the American alliance with Israel, is viewed as a threat to America and its interests through its alliance, its allies, and which he's talked about not just the nuclear capacity, but their their ballistic missile system, and so on. That's what he's concerned about. But you have to wrap it in something because even for someone like Trump, who doesn't who it doesn't even believe that you need to candy coat what you want and why, believes it has to be wrapped in a certain thing. You're doing it for these traditional reasons. Now, I can imagine any other Republican president or a Democratic Party president maybe doing the same thing in Venezuela for one reason or another. But they would be using this this public interest rhetoric far more than Trump does because that's what governments do. That's what governments do. Why did the United States give this nuclear and military umbrella to Western Europe in the form of NATO for all those decades of the post-World War II period? Because the United States views it as interest. Now, of course, when I say the United States, that's a collectivist term. I mean those in power in Washington, in the Pentagon, in the CIA, in the infrastructures of all the related bureaucracies. They viewed it in their interest for their particular motives and intentions and desires. But what did they wrap it in up in? It's to save the West from a communist threat. Beneath the emperor's clothes are the real motives. And it's basically power and misguided conceptions of justifications of what you're doing.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But what's interesting about the Venezuela thing is that they're not even going through a charade of a justification. I mean, Trump knows that Maduro lost that election. Everybody knows he lost that election. He stole the election, which you would think it would hit home with Trump since, he's claiming that his election was stolen. But Maduro clearly stole this election. He wouldn't release his own tallies, and the tallies that the dissidents had were like 80% in favor of the opponents. And so they remain in power. And to me, nobody seems shocked in the United States that the US government is maintaining this illegitimate, unelected regime in power. I mean, he's not even going through the charade of any kind of legitimacy. He says that we want stability. Well, what he means by stability is the national security establishment, because Venezuela, like the United States, is a national security state. What does that mean? It's a massive permanent military establishment. So they've got a Congress just like we do. They got a president just like we do, but they also have this massive, powerful, all-powerful military establishment. No one can afford to take that establishment on in Venezuela or here in the United States. It's too powerful. And so the dissidents have always had this problem. How do you take over this regime without a violent revolution? But even with a violent revolution, how do you go up against this powerful military establishment? It's very, very difficult, if not impossible. Well, it's not impossible, but you're going to lose a lot of life. And so Trump is saying, well, we can't let the opponents even though they're the legitimate office holders, because the national security establishment will be offended and that'll be unstable. So he's looking at this dictatorial regime that has the standing army, the national security establishment behind them, as legitimate because it's now following the orders of the U.S. empire. I mean, did you ever think you see the day when the CIA director would be meeting with a socialist, communist, narco-terrorist head of this regime? Now, we don't know what they talked about. I don't think the press has reported on it. They don't dare ask him what that was discussed like they would if it was the Secretary of State. This is the CIA. I mean, Richard, this is really bizarre stuff that everybody seems to be taking as normal. I don't get it.
The reflection of this is what Trump's attitude is, which also has to do with his insistence that he, you notice how he often uses this this personal pronoun. He needs Greenland. We need to have the Western Hemisphere protected. He's even said that's America's area of interest. It's just a territory that he believes the United States has a right to control for security, for economic benefits. And as far as he's concerned, how do you police it? Well, you don't want to send in your own troops. That gets you into quagmires, which even he understands would be preferable not to get sucked into. So if you don't want to get into a quagmire with boots on the ground, like in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, you just use local surrogates, your local potentates who are beholden to and obedient to you. It's equivalent to like the story, whether true or apocryphal, about Franklin Roosevelt during World War II, when during one of the wartime press conferences in the Oval Office, a reporter asked him, Mr. President, why is it that in Europe we are fighting fascists like Mussolini and Hitler, but we are supporting uh, another fascist, Trujillo, the dictator of Dominican Republic? And supposedly Roosevelt's answer was, Trujillo, he's a fascist, but he's our fascist. That's the mindset. They may be a socialist, but there are socialists. And as long as they play ball and keep things calm so we can gain the things that we desire from their territory, what's the problem? That's the mindset
How
that
is it
that
different
that
though?
dominates Trump. It's like he wants does he know the does he want to know the opinion or the desires of the people of Greenland, whether they be 50 million or the little 50,000 that they are? Do they want to remain part of Denmark? Do they want to be independent? Would they want to be part of the United States? He doesn't care. As far as he's concerned, it's like when Thomas Jefferson did the Louisiana Purchase, where the Indian tribes asked their opinion when France sold it to the United States. No, it's of value to the US, and that's all that counts.
How is that mindset of having your local little puppets different from the Soviet control over Eastern Europe during the whole Cold War, when you had local leaders running the countries, but not independently? They had to take their orders from Moscow. How's that different? How's that mindset different? I don't get it. And
It's not different, but the difference is it's the other side doing it, and that makes it bad. And in Western Europe, well, didn't the British hold elections and a conservative or even a Labour Party socialist become prime minister? Or France, you had a left-wing government or a more conservative president. And the same thing with the chancellor in Germany. It was either the Christian Democrats who were more conservative or the Social Democrats who were socialist. It didn't matter. See, this is our area of common values, but they vote. It's not like we're forcing them to. Now, of course, what is often forgotten is that we did attempt to manipulate elections in both Italy and France in the immediate post-World War II period, precisely because we were afraid that the communists, either on their own or in a coalition with the very left-wing socialists, would come to power and subvert America's interests by cozying up to Moscow. So yes, could be strong arming if it needed to. But in general, there was no problem because both the left socialists who were, quote, democratic and the conservatives in Europe didn't want Soviet domination. So both parties that would come to power, or almost always, wanted to be part of the American empire anyway. So you didn't have to strong arm them the same way that the Soviets had to did, because it was obvious that if the Poles or the Czechoslovakians or the Hungarians or the Romanians and Bulgarians actually had a vote, they would say, we don't want Soviet troops here. But many Europeans did want American troops as long as the Soviets were in Eastern Europe. So the Americans could play have a more beneficent appearance than the Soviets had to.
all right, well, we're about out of time, but I'd be remiss if I didn't point out this, that here everybody's been saying, mocking and ridiculing Russia for not wanting the US and NATO to be getting ever closer to its borders. And we're talking about troops. And oh, that America's a peace-loving nation, Germany's a peace-loving nation. And okay, they did that to Russia in World War II, but that's all over. Russia didn't have to worry. And Russia kept saying, just stay over there, keep NATO over there. No, no, but you have nothing to worry about, Russia. Well, then over here, if Americans are not getting a sense of how the Russian mindset, Trump saying, we will not let the Russians come over here. We will not let the Chinese come over here. Well, how is that mindset any different? And keep in mind that Russia and China were not coming over here with troops and missiles. They were just coming over here with their socialist big dam projects or money or loans. Uh, why doesn't Venezuela have the right, as an independent sovereign country? Why didn't every country have the right to interact with China, Russia, North Korea, Vietnam? The United States interacts with Vietnam. Why is this mindset that they can't do it?
It's because the world is like a game of Risk. If any of the viewers and listeners remember that, it was a board game in which you represented some country and you were battling others for domination of the world. It's a risk game. Who's going to dominate the world or have exclusive control over a large portion of it?
Well, hopefully Americans are doing some soul searching. They're seeing what's going on with Minneapolis. At least there's some good rebellion taking place. People are not blindly supporting everything the government does. And hopefully, when they see this catastrophe in Cuba, the conscience of Americans will be pricked and they'll do some soul searching to get this country back on the right track. All
Well,
right.
one should hope so, but right now I wouldn't hold our breath.
All right. On that note, Richard, it's always a pleasure. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, as always, for your support of FFF. Richard, look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.